Coming up right after the show, it's me, Tyler Baker from the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. It's the fantasy playoffs, and I'm going to help you win a championship this year.
Wow, man, that's awesome. It's almost like I paid you for it.
Advice is always free.
But wait a second. I don't even get paid myself.
Or even.
That's coming up right after the show. Tyler Baker from the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. He's breaking down the Fantasy Football Playoff. He's giving you a Fantasy Football Playoff preview right here on the Pop Culture Cosmos. And thanks for staying with us after the PCC Multiverse. We truly appreciate it, you listening to our show, and thank you so much for having the interest in listening to this bonus material, which we try to provide on virtually each and every episode of the Pop Culture Cosmos and PCC Multiverse, because we truly appreciate you listening to our show. And oh my goodness, what bonus content indeed, because he is here. He is ready. He needed more space, more time, more allotment. He said, Gerald, I need this, man. You just got to whip into shape. You got to set some time aside for me. I need more than my usual time slot. So I said, you know what, man? You're so special. I think I'll put it on the back end right here for you. Your own special little corner of the world of the Pop Culture Cosmos, just for everyone out there, because it is Fantasy Football Playoff preview time, and there's no one better to break this down than my good friend from the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast, which you can listen to every Tuesday and Saturday on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Libsyn. Of course, you can also listen to it on Player.fm and Overcast.fm. It's Tyler Baker. Man, you wanted the space. You got the space for this week. It's all you, my friend. What's going on, man?
The playoffs are here. The fantasy football playoffs are here. And in the NFL, the playoff picture is starting to come into focus, and they are very connected. There are some teams this weekend that have a lot to play for, and some of them are playing for their lives. And even the teams at the top, they don't take Sundays off. So there's some really good matchups this weekend. And for those that are still in it, for those that made it to the playoffs, this is where I'm talking to you, Gerald. This is where you're probably stressing a little bit too hard about who you're going to play, who you're going to bench. So I'm going to talk about some of that stuff this week, what teams have good matchups, what teams don't. And there's maybe even a couple guys on the waiver wire you might want to look at.
Definitely going to be a great program indeed. A must listen for all you fantasy football owners out there. Plus, also as well, you got to check out his Tuesday and Saturday updates on the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast, especially this Saturday coming up, because that will be the last minute info that you need to help gear up for that Sunday playoff run. So let's get off. Let's start it off right now. Mm-hmm. My friend, I'll tell you what, it's going to be a great weekend in the NFL. For someone who is new to the fantasy football playoff format, that is unsure whether they need to make some changes, maybe they have some injuries, or whether or not they should go status quo, what best advice, first off, would you give to brand new playoff, brand new fantasy football owners to the playoff format?
Well, if you're new to fantasy football, something that you've probably learned in your first season is that matchups matter. If you have, some really good players, but they have a tough matchup, only the guys at the very top are matchup proof. And so you've learned this season, hey, take a look at the matchups. When you get into the playoffs, I tend to just play the starters, play your best guys. And if there are a couple of guys that are really close to each other, then look at the matchups. But it seems to be the tendency of new fantasy players to get to the playoffs because it's all on the line now. If you lose, you're done. And they tend to overthink things a little bit too much, try to get cute sometimes. It's just about making the best, most informed decision that you can. And if you have, like I had a guy ask me on the Facebook group if he should bench LaShawn McCoy. I said, no, like you never bench LaShawn McCoy. He's one of the few guys that can get you a 3 touchdown game. Now he hasn't done it, but he has that potential in him. And there are just some guys that you're going to start. You're going to start your studs. So, and there are some teams with tough matchups. You've got Seattle looking at Jacksonville. Don't bench Russell Wilson. Even though that Jacksonville defense is really, really good, nothing happens in that Seattle offense if it doesn't go through Russell Wilson. And if you look at Russell Wilson's career in December, he plays really, really well. So I had another guy ask me if he should bench Russell Wilson. No, Russell Wilson got you there. He can still win it for you. So to any new fantasy players out there, just take a breath, play your best guys, and let the chips fall where they may.
Well, I'll tell you what, I wished my opponent for this weekend in the fantasy football playoffs had benched Russell Wilson, because that's who I'm going up against. So I'm really on pins and needles this weekend. But definitely a great place to go. And before I go ahead and finalize my lineups, I'm going to head on over to the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast Facebook group and make sure that I present my lineup and say, hey, is this what I need to run with? I need your advice. I need everybody out there who is part of the group to share their thoughts if this is what I should go with, because I have definitely throughout this season cannot thank everyone enough, especially you and everyone else who runs and also is a part of the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast Facebook group, because you've given me advice, of course, across the season that has been invaluable in my team making the playoffs and being a competitive team overall in the league.
Hey man, there's some great guys that are on that group, and I even have people like message me because they don't want to put it on the Facebook group just in case their opponent is out there. So I get a lot of that too. So any questions that are asked, they do get answered. Now, if you get on Sunday morning and try to ask a question, I'm just not going to see it because I've got other stuff to do than be on Facebook. But if you go on there anytime from now through Saturday, post a question, it'll get answered, and you'll most likely get a couple different perspectives on it, on your question.
That interests me though, that if somebody goes ahead and just like secretly DMs you and
they do it,
it's like what is that other person going to do? Oh, well, I'm going to prevent you from starting Tom Brady. Yeah, you can't do that. That's a no. It's like,
Sure. Well, that's especially true for waiver pickups. I'll get a message like, what do you think about this guy? Like they don't want to put it out there.
Well, that's different. That's different. Starting lineups, that's pretty much something they can't prevent. But definitely, I agree with you on waiver lineups indeed. And you mentioned that there's a couple of waiver wire people that are out there that may be of interest. Yeah. Because due to injuries or whatnot, maybe something that people need to be concerned themselves, or even a fantasy football defense or kicker that they may be interested as well.
Sure. In fact, I went out and picked up Buffalo's defense to play over Philadelphia, actually. Yeah, just because I like the matchup. So this week, it looks like Joe Mixon is out. That's going to open up the door for Giovanni Bernard to get some work. He got a lot of work last week. He did pretty well with it. And in Phoenix, Adrian Peterson is going to be out. And at the same time, Kerwin Williams is coming back to practice, so it looks like he's a go for this week. Also, Greg Olsen and Zach Ertz looks like they're going to go. Olsen was practicing. Ertz got a partial practice. He's still technically in the concussion protocol, but the team is very optimistic that he's going to play. We're also going to get Rashard Matthews back this week. He's practicing. Looks like he's a go. And probably the most interesting story is that Aaron Rodgers is practicing in pads. Now, that is a very, very good sign for him coming back, not this week, but the next week at the earliest. Now, this week, Green Bay has the Browns. So there's no game in the NFL is decided before it happens. But if there was a game on the schedule that they felt comfortable that they were going to get a win, it's Cleveland. Then after that, Green Bay has the Vikings, the Panthers, and the Lions. So Green Bay has a really tough 3-game stretch coming up. And if Aaron Rodgers is ready to go, they're going to need him so that they can win out. If they don't win out, I don't think they get a wild card spot in the NFC, because there are already 3 8-team wins going into this weekend. 3 teams with 8 wins going into this weekend. So Green Bay is in a tough spot, but to see that Aaron Rodgers is practicing in pads, he might be out there in on the waivers, possibly in some leagues. Pick him up. He could come back in a play in week 14, 15.
That's definitely something to think about indeed. Once again, it's Tyler Baker of the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. You can catch his show every Tuesday and Saturday right before the playoffs are really going to kick into high gear. So you want to check out his latest podcast. They're available on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Overcast, Player.fm, and definitely some great listening to there. And like I said, Apple Podcasts, the major source of podcasting out there, where you can find our show as well. Mm-hmm. So definitely some great thoughts so far. But you said you also wanted to talk some personnel changes and also some firings in the NFL that may make some headlines for fantasy football owners, football teams as well.
Yeah, well, in Cleveland, they fired their general manager. He was the executive vice president of football operations, I think was his title, but he was basically the general manager. Well, he was fired. And the owner, when he announced that Hugh Jackson was going to coach the rest of this year, and that he was also going to coach in 2018. So that's a pretty big statement. I want to say, I had it pulled up here, but I want to say that Hugh Jackson's record as a head coach is like 9-36 or something like that. It's absolutely terrible. And Gerald, I wanted to ask you, because you're a football fan, you've been watching it for quite a while. Can you think of a coach that has such a poor winning percentage on what was largely considered an underachieving team, considering all of the young talent that they have, how he still has a job?
Well, I just think he's probably very inexpensive to retain his services. B, that they probably don't want to have to pay to retain his services while they pay another coach. C, if they're going to be in the midst of a long turnaround, you might as well keep him. Yeah, you might as well keep him as a coach. And D, he actually may actually have some great qualities as a coach you might want to retain. And a situation like Brett Brown with Philadelphia 76ers. For years, this process that they have talked about with the drafting year after year after year, and waiting for Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons to come back from injury, and just saying, hey, Brett Brown is the guy for us. He's a great coach. We know the record stinks, and year after year, 76ers were really at the bottom of the NBA for years. But look at them now. They're right in the midst of the playoff hunt. Brett Brown is leading them. All it took was some great health on that end by 2 of their major marquee players. So I could see something going ahead favorable for Cleveland down the road, because A, they will have a huge ton of cap space next summer if they want to go ahead on a free agent blitz. And B, they have 6 extra draft picks in the April draft, which, if done right, and you have a general manager that knows what he's doing, can really provide Hugh Jackson with a quality team, a competitive team, real quickly, faster than anybody thinks. And also, you'll be able to see then and gauge then if Hugh Jackson is the coach going forward for your Cleveland franchise. So I think it's giving him a fair shot.
Yeah, and very shortly after they announced the firing, they announced that they were hiring John Dorsey, who was the former general manager of the Kansas City Chiefs, and he managed to put a pretty good team together there. So with the abundance of draft picks, and for Hugh Jackson's terrible record, the players love him, and evidently the team loves him too. I'm not anti Hugh Jackson. I've always liked him as a coach, but the NFL is all about now, winning now. What have you done for me lately? And I would expect
at least it isn't in New York. In New York, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So you're right. This might just be a trust the process thing, and they got a good GM in there. They have. I thought that Cleveland was going to be a lot better this year than they have been. And that's something you can't blame on a general manager, to be honest with you. That's coaching. So maybe they need to clean some guys out of that locker room. Maybe, I don't know, but Cleveland, they're a better team only in the potential that Sashi Brown gave them with all of the draft picks and all of the cap room. So I don't know. We'll see. Cleveland, unfortunately, has been a dumpster fire for a while, and looks like it's going to keep burning.
Well, that's being the case for fantasy football owners. That will mean going forward some great options if done correctly with some free agent signings, and also as well for some draft picks that could materialize with some great numbers for the 2018 season.
Yeah, and there could be some rookies next year that you want to take a shot on. With all those draft picks. Well, for fantasy this year, though, Josh Gordon is back, and he looked good enough last week that I think if you have him, you might want to start him this week, because what else do they have? A whole bunch of firings just happened. Hugh Jackson has got this brand new toy. I got a feeling Josh Gordon gets the ball a lot.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, because he did get a surprising amount of targets than what I thought he was going to do. So definitely that's something to look forward to indeed. But there is more to this weekend in the NFL that you want to break down, because there's some big matchups that are going to affect fantasy football team owners out there, especially now because it is do or die. Usually it comes down to what? 14 playoff, sometimes a 16, sometimes an 18, but usually a 14 playoff right now going forward.
Usually it's a 6-team with 2 teams getting a first round bye.
Oh, okay, because I'm on a 4-team myself.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I played in one of those last year. And yeah, you have to be good to make the playoffs. And then after that, you have to keep winning. That's the thing about the fantasy playoffs. There are some fantasy playoff formats where each round of the playoffs will be 2 weeks, and that makes it a little fairer, I guess, a little more even. You get those 2 weeks to battle an opponent. But those start early and usually end on week 17. So you don't see that a lot of times. So for most fantasy leagues, this is it, do or die. So if you have any questions, definitely go to the Facebook group, Fanatsy Football Paydirt Podcast group on Facebook. That's the best way to ask a question about your specific lineup and your specific team. But looking at some of these matchups this weekend, there are going to be some tough ones. A lot of fantasy stock has been put into the Philadelphia Eagles and the Los Angeles Rams, and those two teams are going to be playing this weekend. And I'll tell you, they both have really good defenses. And I know a lot of fantasy players are hoping for a shootout. I don't think that's going to be the case just from watching these teams. And there's some familiarity there because the Rams coach, Sean McVay, he coached in Washington for a while, and Washington played Philadelphia twice a year for most of Sean McVay's career. So he's familiar with this team. And Philly is used to that Sean McVay offense. So there's some familiarity there. I think this is going to be much more of a defensive game than some people are anticipating. Another great matchup, Seattle and Jacksonville, two really good defenses battling out. We talked about Russell Wilson a little bit earlier. It's going to be difficult to try to predict what Seattle's going to do, because with that Jacksonville defense, there's not that many ways that you can beat them, and Seattle really doesn't have a running game. So there's a lot of question marks for me as to how Russell Wilson gets it done. I think Jimmy Graham's probably the best bet on that offense this weekend. Baltimore and Pittsburgh. I mean, that's like the football game. Twice a year we get Baltimore and Pittsburgh, and that's always a great game. This is in Pittsburgh. Baltimore actually is still alive in the playoff hunt, so if the playoffs were to come today, they would be in. So Baltimore is really fighting to hold on to that. So this is going to be a really good game. If there was a defense that I was going to pick up off of the waiver wire this week, because I know I benched Philadelphia's defense just because the potential there. The potential is there for a shootout. So I went with a safer defense, and that was Buffalo. They've been playing pretty well lately. They're going against an Indianapolis team that tends to turn the ball over. And Buffalo is still very much in the hunt in the AFC for a playoff spot. So that is a defense that if you want to go to the waiver wire and pick one up, you could. I think Dallas's defense has a good shot. Even though they're not a great defense, I think they have a good shot to generate some turnovers against the Giants this weekend. So there are some defenses out there, maybe if you want to pick up. And then there are a couple fantasy. If you have stocks in certain teams, you're a little nervous this weekend. Miami going up against New England. I don't want any pieces of that offense. I know Kenyon Drake has really put himself out there as the starter in Miami. Damian Williams may come back, but that is an offense that's just not doing a whole lot. And against New England, playing good football in December. If I have Miami players, I'm a little bit nervous.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you real quick was the quarterback is such an integral position to fantasy football owners out there, just like in real life in the NFL. I know there's some names out there that can really make or break you as far as numbers are concerned. One name in particular that I was seeing on waiver wires is Josh McCown, who has proven to be a top 10 quarterback out there. Should people be interested in picking him up or utilizing him if they have him on a roster already as a number one option, or should they hold off and play better options at this point in time?
Well, I don't think we could have sat here a year ago and say that in December, the Jets were going to Denver and were favored. we would have been laughed out of the room. So that's just this NFL season. And if you look at Josh McCown, he's playing very good football, and he's been doing it all year. So if you did have a matchup sometime in your playoff run that you didn't like, because you're really looking at just the next couple weeks and what the matchups are with your players to see if you can improve. If you see some really bad matchups, get Josh McCown on your bench. And if nothing else, you take him away from somebody else that may be needing a quarterback at some point in the fantasy playoffs. So now this weekend against Denver, that Denver defense is not what it's always been. It's really not that good of a defense now. At least that's how they're playing now. They were in the Super Bowl last year, and so it still is a good team with good veteran experience. But right now, they're not playing good football, and that's why the Jets are favored by 1 going into Denver, which is insane. But that just tells you how much that Denver defense has fallen off and how good Josh McCown has that Jets offense running.
That's some great advice indeed. Once again, it's Tyler Baker from the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. Check out his Facebook group, which you can become a part of, the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast Facebook group. Join up. Check. You can ask about waiver wire pickups, lineup changes, and the whole 9 yards, especially for those people out there who are on the brink of maybe even getting their first or many championships out there in fantasy football, because we're right in the midst of a great fantasy football playoff season. Tyler, any last thoughts on the way out, on what you're thinking as far as a great weekend in the NFL?
Well, there's going to be some great games, and I know a lot of fantasy players are sweating a little bit, and it's just a time to make tough decisions.
Me included.
Look, I made one, and I am benching Philadelphia's defense. Even though I think it's going to be a defensive game, I'm benching them because I'm looking at that Buffalo matchup, and I'm saying, you know what? I'm going to roll the dice there. And it is just a defense. So what are they going to be, a couple points apart? But every point matters. And so everybody's got tough decisions. I just benched Philadelphia's defense and picked up Buffalo off the waiver wire. Even though I think it's going to be a defensive game between them and the Rams, I'm still making the best decision that I can. I'm a lot more comfortable with Buffalo's defense in Philadelphia. So it's little choices like that you have to make. And it always helps to get another perspective. It always helps to ask someone else's opinion. You don't have to take my advice, but I'll give you advice and let you know why I'm giving you that advice.
That is awesome advice indeed. And once again, it is Tyler Baker from the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. You got to check it out every Tuesday and especially this Saturday on Apple Podcasts, also as well Libsyn, Overcast.fm, Player.fm, SoundCloud. And I'll tell you what, Tyler, it's been so great putting this little corner of the pop culture cosmos universe just for you. And I'll tell you what, it's been truly a pleasure having this extended version of the Fantasy Football Corner that we kind of call it and whatnot. So we truly appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and shooting the breeze and getting those teams that are out there that are gearing up for the fantasy football playoff run and giving them the advice they need. And we'll be back on the Monday edition of the show talking about all the collateral damage. And I'll tell you what, you're either going to have me very happy or very sad. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, be sure to get on the Facebook page and post the lineup, and we'll take a look at it. And I mean, it's do or die time. It's right now. It's the playoffs are happening. So if you're still in it, give yourself a pat on the back, settle down, make the best decisions that you can. Try not to overthink it, but stressing about fantasy football is part of the fun, I think.
Definitely indeed. And I wish everyone out there that's involved in the fantasy football playoffs that are out there in your league all the best of luck this weekend, especially you, Tyler, my friend. I hope you knock them dead, and we'll see what we can do, that you're giving such great advice, and hopefully that great advice can lead to wins this weekend for everybody who follows it out there.
That's right. Best of luck to you.
Indeed. Once again, it's Tyler Baker from the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. My friend, I'll tell you what, it's been a great, great segment indeed, and we wish everyone out there all the best this weekend in the NFL from your friends right here at the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast and, of course, the Pop Culture Cosmos.